Good morning and welcome to Justice Talks. My name is Amy Barasch. I'm the Executive Director at Her Justice. And today we are honored to meet with the CEO of the National Women's Law Center and gender justice warrior, Fatima Goss Graves. Welcome, Fatima.
It's so good to be with you.
We're really thrilled to talk with you today. April is, among other things, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we have a particular topic we want to get into. But before we launch into that main discussion, I wondered if you could say one or two sentences about the incredible organization that is the National Women's Law Center. At Her Justice, we're huge fans. We read everything you do. We cite you constantly, but I want to make sure that our viewers are equally aware of what you do at the center.
Well, I should begin by saying I'm also a huge fan of Her Justice and really pleased to be here today. At the National Women's Law Center, we fight for gender justice, and we do that in the courts by taking on cases that affect the lives of women and girls. We do that as advocates for federal and state policy change, and we do that work to improve the cultural conversations that we are having across the lives of women and girls.
That's so important, and especially that cultural conversation part, right, seems to be where we need to make some real movement right now. And as I understand it, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is housed at the Law Center. Is that right?
That is right. And it is now, no longer a baby. We launched the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund with brilliant attorneys around the country and entertainers who wanted to use their platform in January of 2018. And so we're now a few years old. But the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is housed and run by the National Women's Law Center. Time's Up itself is a separate organization, although we obviously work super closely with them. And at the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, we connect people with attorneys and with storytelling assistants who have experienced harassment and related retaliation at work. And we've been able to help over 4,000 people find that sort of assistance in the last 4 years.
That's really incredible. And it's interesting because we, at Her Justice, we have what we call a pro bono first model. So we're always connecting private attorneys to the women living in poverty we serve. So it's a familiar sounding model. And it's also just amazing that it's been around for that long. COVID and everything else has made time this strange elastic beast. So I'm glad that you now have a toddler, and really walking and running along. Our mission at Her Justice, as I said, is to stand with women living in poverty in New York City. And we do that by providing free legal services in the areas of family, divorce, and immigration law. And over 80% of our clients have experienced intimate partner violence. And we know that sexual violence is very commonly part of that, totality of violence that they've suffered. And those experiences are particularly hard for people to share. And for the 90% of our clients who are women of color, telling those stories of sexual violence is made that much harder for a couple of different reasons, and deciding when and to whom they can tell those stories. So, it's in that context that we wanted to invite you here to talk about an initiative that is a coalition of the National Women's Law Center, Me Too International, and the Time's Up Foundation, which you launched, called We as Ourselves, which is a campaign to change the conversation about how sexual violence and its impact on Black communities is held. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you and these other coalitions decided that this was needed, and why now?
Well, and I think your example from the work you do at Her Justice is exactly why we worked with those three anchor organizations, but a lot of leaders around the country to launch We as Ourselves. We started initially with a love letter to Black survivors, actually. And the love letter was basically an opportunity to say, we see you, we support you, we are fighting for and with you and by your side. But we also understand that for Black survivors in particular, it is difficult for their experiences to be told, even if they want to come forward. The many, many people who don't want to come forward have a long list of very good reasons why they don't, right? They are facing systems that don't serve them well. They are facing narratives and tropes that basically amount to "we don't believe you," that are tropes that are so rooted in racist and sexist stereotypes. We don't even, they're so a part of the fabric of this country. We don't even recognize them all the time as the tropes that they are, but they very much shape the day-to-day experiences. And so we wanted to, on purpose, start a conversation, and we started it among Black people, among Black organizations, in Black media, in a targeted way, to begin to say, what would it look like to actually show up for Black survivors? And it has been both a really beautiful and important launch. That's why we started it with a love letter. But we also have been really gratified by the many, many people who this resonated with, who are joining with us. We started with specific and detailed work in Black media, with some work that we did with BET and The Root and some other Black media organizations. And that was, again, on purpose, so that we are reaching people and starting a conversation first there. But it is our deep, deep hope that the sort of cultural narratives that make it hard for people to tell them stories, to come forward, to see themselves, even to see themselves in the Me Too movement, a movement that was framed up and launched by a Black woman for Black survivors. We knew we had to take this on.
And what that it is so powerful. And we always, when we reference Me Too, talk about Tarana Burke and sort of how, it was really great to get, as you've said before, women with power to raise up voices and to bring some more power back. But then you have to go back to where those stories originated and lift up the original stories. Um, and I wonder if you think that this is a particular time, a particular moment in activism. It feels very different to me. And so we as ourselves is a coalition of coalitions, in essence, working together for this. And I wonder if you see this. You've been a social change actor for a long time, a lawyer working in activism for a long time. Do you think that this is a different kind of activism that's taking place?
I do. I actually think we're in a period in history of movements, right? Whether we're talking about movement for Black lives or Me Too movement, um, it is a time where individuals can be connected, can be involved, can be change agents, actually pretty easily, right? It is not hard to find a path to get involved, and people are doing so because they understand the ability of themselves as individuals to make change. And that changes the work of all of our organizations, whether you've been around for a couple years, or like the National Women's Law Center, where we turn 50 next year. So we're not new to being an organization, but this is a peak period in activism, and it is our job to meet that activism. It's our job to help provide containers and ways for people to come to get involved. We've even seen a difference in our litigation, and I wonder if this is true for you, where people feel a part of it. Beyond the individual clients, right? People are watching, they're rooting, and they see and understand why they have a stake in an individual's case in ways that are very, very different from before.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And again, because we do pro bono work, it's a great, a lot of our volunteer lawyers will say that everybody learned through that process and they felt so connected to what they were doing. And especially now, people want to be engaged. I wonder if you have thoughts, particularly for lawyers, right? Because we're both lawyers. We are sort of moving a little bit, following your lead or following the law center's lead, moving into this policy space. As a lawyer, have you seen new and different ways that lawyers can be change agents? I've often said when I talk to our colleagues that they should think of themselves as change agents. I don't know that as lawyers, traditional lawyers, that we're trained to think that way necessarily, but I do believe that that's possible and powerful. So have you thought, as you've grown up within the law center, have you thought about different ways to use the law for change? And do you think you and others are doing that differently now?
Yeah, one of the things So at its founding, the Law Center has always been multi-strategy. And so, and over the last many decades, people have often said, well, maybe you should change your name to the Law and Policy Organization or the Law and Policy and Culture Organization. And people who know me, I hate name changes. And so I've always, when anyone has suggested that, I've buried my head in the sand. But the truth of it is, we use the law in all its form. We think of it really, really broadly. And so that's why we talk and sort of help people understand that the role that the law plays, sometimes it is about representing individual clients, and that's a really important part of that work. But actually, many of our clients, even if they have an individual result, they're deeply interested in being advocates for more, right? They're interested in changing the laws and improving the policies for that next person, even if they won't actually experience a specific change themselves. Many of our clients are committed and passionate advocates in the end for justice for all. And so when we say law, we also include the work to change laws. We include the nitty gritty granular work to write regulations and guidance that actually makes our laws come to life. I actually think we will have the sort of shift we need if the change we are seeking in the world, if it shows up in the laws, but it also shows up in our policies, it shows up in the way institutions are run, and the way workplaces run, the way schools run, the way housing is set up. And if it shows up in the cultural conversations, if people have conversations around the water cooler or whatever the virtual water cooler is these days in the grocery store, in the same way you would hope they would have conversations around institutions, then you know you're making some real progress. And all of that we see as law.
I think that's, I love hearing that personally, because that's exactly what I think and what we've been thinking around our policy work. And I think you've been so great at the center, you know, it's true for the We as Ourselves movement and for the other movements you're talking about, in really understanding that cultural conversations are policy, are law. You know, we can't, it has to all be of a package, and we need to be changing. You're so great at changing these really big cultural conversations, whether it's about women as caregivers or Black survivors of sexual violence, and that needs to go along with the nitty gritty of line editing or regulation, right? They all have to come together.
That's
Do you have any wisdom for us around changing cultural conversations? How do you think about that, and how do you, you know, make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think part of it is understanding the stories and conversations people are actually having right now. So if you're trying to change a conversation, you know, what's the conversation that people are having right now? What is the long story? Some of these are like long stories that we'd like to upend. You know, you mentioned caregiving, and that is a conversation that, frankly, people were having in whispers and maybe sometimes in shouts over this last year during the pandemic, but they were having this conversation before then, right? They were having a conversation around how the fact that we didn't really have meaningful care infrastructure. And sometimes that conversation was very personalized, with people naming that they felt like they were good at it or not good at it, they were failing or not failing. You know, there's lots of sort of self-help type articles about how do you make it all work. And the conversation we sought to have this year, when our care infrastructure totally imploded, um, and women in particular were asked to work and care, and in some cases, homeschool, all at the same time. That pain that people felt in understanding that it wasn't working helped people understand that actually we need an infrastructure around this. We need, if this is so important to our economy, to our businesses, to our family, to everyone, we actually need a plan and an infrastructure to make it work. We need to treat it like the serious challenge it is.
Absolutely. And we, you know, one of our big policy efforts has been around child support, and it's a similar idea, is that, you know, people, women of color have really been bearing the brunt of this calamity we've been facing for a long time. They've been bearing the brunt, but then during this COVID moment, it just kind of shone a light on how we don't have a system in place. The system we can say the system broke down or there was no system there. But
Right.
you're right, our clients have been trying to do all of those things at the same time as they're essential workers and as they're trying to figure out safety for themselves and their kids. And then, the courts are not fully functional and they can't get the income they need to do all those things. So it has, and I wanted to go back to congratulating the center on turning 50 as someone who has 50 in their rear view
Well, next year,
mirror. Next
next
year,
year.
next year. But I'm just telling you, women in their 50s, I think very powerful. So I think the center is going to be even more powerful as you enter your 50s. Um, One of the conversations you talked about, sort of these cultural conversations that are going on in whispers or in screams, in other places that we need to like hear and lift up. For us, one of the big conversations that's going on in the field of intimate partner violence is we're sort of having this long overdue reckoning with how joined at the hip we've been with the criminal justice system for a really long time. And that's been our traditional response to intimate partner violence. It's been our traditional response to sexual violence. And that reliance has been problematic for a long time, especially for Black victims and for other victims of color. So the intimate partner violence movement, which is a movement that I come out of, is really sort of trying to reckon with that. And even those of us who work in the civil system, acknowledging that, fine, maybe we get someone a civil order of protection, but if you want that enforced, you're calling the police and an arrest is possible. And now you have to decide, do I want to trigger that system or not? So it's a profoundly complicated moment for folks. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about, as you're working with We As Ourselves, I hear that a lot of that is about changing cultural conversation, but it's coming particularly at a moment where there is obviously profound questioning and conversation around the role of the criminal justice system in our society.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I like to think about it is around if you start from a goal of safety, the question is, are people actually feeling safe?
Mm.
And when that question around the relationship between policing and gender-based violence is interrogated more deeply, the answer is they aren't feeling more safe.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the way the police engage with communities makes it less likely people are willing to call the police. And there are countless, and I'm sure you have these among your clients too, but there are countless stories and experiences of survivors calling the police for support and being treated as criminals themselves. And so it's broken, right? It's broken. We worked with a lot of folks in the fall to launch a survivor agenda, and had a big summit that was still one of my, 2020 had a lot of very dark and terrible moments, but the Survivor Summit was not one of them. It was actually a beautiful offering that a lot of folks came together to work on. And in that agenda, we acknowledge that there are areas where people aren't fully aligned. And this is an area where I think the solution lies in survivor-led conversations, right? That one of the things that people really worried about, especially during the uprising around racial injustice and policing more broadly, is that you see people who actually don't have survivors' interests at heart use survivors to maintain a status quo that actually isn't working. And so one of the things that everyone aligned on, whether there is some disagreement around the role of police or not, is that survivors should lead these conversations. That if we are doing it in the name of survivors, if you are policing in the name of survivors, you need to know what survivors actually think about this experience.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And as I said, we're questioning ourselves because we, for a long time, felt sort of safely over in the civil side of the legal system, but
Yeah.
they're inextricably linked. The system requires that you engage the criminal justice system. And then what is our role in that? And how do we have that conversation with clients? And to your point, we need to respect what they think is safety for them, which may mean under the current system that certain options aren't available for them, and that's not acceptable. So we need to reinvent all of those.
Yeah, and I also think, part of the tough conversation is policing isn't the only system that isn't serving survivors well, right? And once you start going down that road, you start acknowledging in what's happening in the other system, what's happening in the social welfare system, what's happening, how, and so it is, they are tough conversations, but the fact that people are having them and thinking deeply about where our resources should go, thinking deeply about what it actually means to create the conditions where people can be safe, that has me really hopeful. And we all are part of it. I mean, the Law Center doesn't have, we're sort of in a similar situation where we don't have, a line of work around the criminal justice system around in that way. To the extent we work on the criminal justice system, it really is around the ways in which school discipline policies, for example, push people into contact with police in ways that are inappropriate. But that doesn't mean that we can sit this conversation out, because the truth is, whether you're in the conversation or not, people are talking exactly about the work you do. They're talking about your clients as a part of it. So you have to be at the table.
Absolutely. Well, I think I've heard you say before that you love bringing sort of unlikely folks together for conversations, because really fruitful solutions can come out of that. And I really appreciate that, because I think, to your point, it feels safe to sit in our little civil system bubble. Not that that's working well, but we can focus on that and try to correct that. But all of these systems are interconnected. And most importantly, they're interconnected for our clients. So we're doing our clients a disservice if we try to take each of these into sort of a siloed piece. We need to understand how they're all interconnected, and one, it's some crazy Rube Goldberg machine where when you get into one system, it's going to necessarily initiate the other system. I wonder if you've had any thoughts from the work on We As Ourselves about different responses to sexual violence in particular, because that too our sort of instinct has been, or the cultural instinct has been, a criminal justice response, which, is often really problematic.
Well, one of the things that, because that isn't the work that we do at the Law Center, but we do work on institutional responses a lot, right? On the role of workplaces, on the role of schools, on the role of housing. And there are a range of approaches that these institutions can be taking to ensure people can either work or learn or live with safety and with dignity, right? And there are longstanding laws, as you know, that actually require that they address sex discrimination within those institutions, including harassment, including violence. And these are obligations that people have hid from for a long time. And I would say that was the truth really until Me Too went viral. And it was a giant awakening around both obligations, but also the roles there that institutions can play. So one of the things that I really hope that people will continue to understand and lean into is the way in which you can create conditions inside of institutions that embody, the qualities of safety and dignity. That is possible, right? And I'd argue that is an obligation. I'd also say, you hear a lot of conversation about what it looks like for social workers to be engaged. I think social workers themselves, and have said, there's a lot of work they have to do to deal with bias within social work. And actually that reflection that I saw coming from social worker or organizations, I was really encouraged by. So if there is interest in treating and expanding the role of counselors and social workers in this space, they have to be ready to do that work in ways where people are whole. So I start from the premise that it's all of our jobs to create the conditions where people can be safe. Part of that is creating conditions where people actually want to come forward when they have experienced harm. If they are not coming forward, that is our challenge, right? That is our challenge, even identifying. And a big part of the come forward is that something important will happen. Like people don't just come forward with the hope that something negative will happen or that nothing important will happen, that their experience will stay the same.
Yeah, absolutely. There has to be a reason for them to come forward. We have to meet them in the right place and give them
Right.
what they need.
And what reasons are we giving people now? Like that's the thing that we have to continue to interrogate.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's right about so many fields. I mean, obviously the legal field as well, right? There's a lot to interrogate in the legal field and sort of why our field was created and what statuses we are trained to uphold. And I've often said to folks, I have this sort of graduate degree in systems, and I'm trying to fight for social justice and trying to think about what does that look like when my entire industry is built on, being supported by the existing systems. I wanted to ask you one thing you said. I was really intrigued. I agree with you that systems need to change and that change for systems should be an exciting opportunity. But I think you must have encountered, as I know I have, a resistance to change from inside institutions. Do you have any thoughts, I guess, about why there is so much resistance or how you approach that resistance to get folks to see that actually this is a great opportunity?
Yeah, well, I think people generally don't like change. There have been studies that show that if you move the copy machine 3 feet over, it causes havoc inside workplaces because it's the copy machine's always there and it's where I'm used to going. People don't like change. And I actually think part of the discomfort is that change is happening fast, right? We had long periods where it felt like, tiny incremental change. And then some folks have woken up and it seems like overnight the
Yeah.
expectations have shifted. Well, the truth is, those were always the expectations, is that there was no effort around making it real. And so the thing that I would say is that it's going to happen one way or another. And when I think about workplaces in particular, they have two options. They can either be a leader and look at their systems, or they can wait until they're on the front page. And 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 I say that not because I don't think that people are uninterested in creating real conditions where their employees can thrive. I actually think you'd ask any leader and they'd say, yes, that's what I want. But it's also hard to do. And so when you have a lot of different priorities and a lot of things that are hard to do, it's hard to actually decide, and we're going to do things really different. When it was really it seemed easier to just bury your head in the sand. And so I actually think the culture is calling for change and it's coming. And the question is it going to come easy or is it going to come hard?
Right, right. Well, and that goes back to your commitment to having these big cultural conversations. I do think it's so important because that is sort of a precondition. It, as you said, with the law, you push in a lot of different places, and the cultural conversations is one place to push. And so institutions hopefully are looking around and listening and hearing this is where the conversation is. You need to be on the front of that train, and you don't want to be left behind. I just want to, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but I want to end on something you mentioned earlier. I've heard you say before that you're an optimist and that to be a sort of social change warrior, you need some level of optimism. So I think I meet you there, clear-eyed optimism. But what is making you optimistic right now? What is giving you hope right now?
So I definitely am an optimist. I kind of think you don't do this work and think and wake up in the morning and say, I don't think I'm going to win. Like it would be hard to keep doing the work. The thing that is actually making me hopeful is that I was reminded when we passed the American Rescue Plan that this country can do big things, big and important things that actually meet the moment and support those who are most in need. And I frankly wasn't sure if we could do it, if we could have the courage to do it. And we did it. And turns out it was popular with people people in this country. And it is a reminder that we can do big and bold, important things, even if there's some, corner of the world saying no. And that will fuel me for a while.
That's great. Thank you for that. That fuels me as well. I really appreciate you speaking with us today, Fatima, and keep on fighting for justice. And we hope to be fighting along with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.